Hello everyone, Mike the Warrior here. A couple months ago, I did a video ranking the final battle from each season. Well, this time around, I'm gonna rank the first battle of each season, as well as kind of the first episode. Kind of self-explanatory, but basically, I'm going to be going through each season of the Gen 1 of Battle Brawlers. So from, Battle Brawlers all the way to Mechtanium Surge, looking at the first episode and how I view the episode itself and the battle that takes place, or battles. But for ones like the Mechtanium Surge Part 1 and Part 2, I'll kind of be taking like the big one into consideration because there's some small ones that happen, but we'll cover that when we get there. Ranking the final battles was honestly just really fun, and I thought might as well give my thoughts on each of the opening fights to each season and see how you guys feel about them as well. Without further ado, let's get started. The first two can honestly be switched, but if I had to have one at the bottom, I guess it would be Mechtanium Surge Episode 1, Dan versus Ben. Now, before we get to the battle itself, Episode 1 of Mechtanium Surge, like many others, when we start a new season, is basically trying to set up the new status quo. And out of all the big changes, this one, for me, is easily the worst. First things first, I hate that Jake just completely quit Bakugan off screen. Two, I mentioned this in my Fixing Mechtanium Surge video, but it really also bothers me, at least in the dub, it's blatantly said that Murcho basically completely gave up the rights to Bakugan Inner Space. And while I will give him somewhat of a leeway on he doesn't have, the power of hindsight, but a large portion of what happens later in this season doesn't really happen if Murcho didn't do that. But moving on to the actual major battle, because there's some little ones to show off how good Dan is. Dan versus Ben, well, as I just said, Dan and Drago are really powerful now, and I think Drago's just way too overpowered to be struggling this hard against Ben, though I will also give them credit that Drago can't really control his abilities, but that excuse really only works with me by so much. Like, by the end of Gundalian Invaders, it is 100% established that Dan and Drago are supposed to be the ultimate Bakugan, and for them to be struggling against a nobody like Ben to this degree is absolutely insane to me. Yes, he does end up doing a 2 against 1 at one point, but even before that, it seems like Drago is the underdog for most of this battle, and it really, really irks me. If I have to give the battle 1 point, I do think the environment of, having the battle happen in this virtual city was a good idea, but that's honestly kind of it. Also, for some context, this was my first time seeing the first episode when I was rewatching it, in the process of me deciding to make this channel. So like 2020 or so, right? Before that, I never saw the first episode. And I asked my brother to confirm this. We remember, Cartoon Network was hyping up the new season of Bakugan. After Gundalian Invaders ended, we run downstairs that morning to watch the first episode, and we didn't see it. We see the second episode. So when I was watching this, and I am completely confused on what's going on here until I realized that we never saw the first episode as a kid, it was pretty interesting. So I don't even have the comparison on how I saw it when I was a kid, like some of the other times I bring up, a lot of these episodes and a lot of these battles and characters and whatnot. This was my first time watching it because I never saw it as a kid. So the things I don't like about this battle is still kind of fresh for me. If episode 2 was actually the debut episode of Mechtanium Surge, I probably would have had it a bit higher. The episode isn't, great or anything to really write home about, but the mystery of Zethon and just the Mechtagaun in general were interesting to me at the time. But yeah, with that, let's move on to what we have next, and that would be... Next, we have Dan versus Shunji, I believe, the fat guy from the first season. The reason this is the second lowest for me, well, again, just like the previous one, I didn't actually watch the first ever episode of Bakugan, and this is the episode that started the franchise off, and it starts off pretty alright, introducing us to Dan and his mom's doing yoga, which is kind of a running gag. And it shows the dynamic between the two, which does become important later on. But overall, the first episode feels really inconsistent with the rest of the season. Yeah, sometimes when you release your pilot episodes for your series, the rest can be a little, different. but this didn't really seem that exciting to me. I think that's basically it. Overall, it was kind of a little boring. Like, also, I'm gonna assume again that maybe the dub just did this, but we know that Dan basically helped create the game Bakugan, and then, some little things can take him off guard. This is something that was, decided much later, but Dan talks about how he's never seen a Subterra before, and that isn't obviously possible, but knowing that Dan helped create this game, I always just thought that was hilarious. I just think that's hilarious when I finally saw it. And in terms of, the battle itself, they fight twice in the first episode, and both times it just feels kind of meh. This is also how we're supposed to truly understand how this game is played, and I can't really use something like Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Pokemon as an example here like I would normally do, because the Pokemon anime, well, kind of animes it up when it comes to their battles, and the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime also is just kind of making things up as they go along. And my overall point being is that I wish we kind of got a bit more of a explanation on what was going on as the battle progresses. Like, oh, they could break down the rules for us while we're watching. And the main reason I bring this up, because I know the rules. Like, I knew the rules when I finally watched this episode at that point. But to see how everything kind of came to be, I think would have been an interesting aspect in terms of a debut. Because I'm imagining if I had watched this first episode when it came out, I just know I would have been a little confused in terms of, well, what's going on? Kinda. It's not completely confusing. Like, the G power is here, and we see that when they use ability cards and gate cards, they do certain things, but it just wasn't really that exciting overall. Like, the first episode, the furthest to the, or closest to the first episode I always saw was the Masquerade episode. And while they still didn't stop to explain, oh, this is an ability card, yada, 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 like, there were some things where you could tell that something's up. For example, when Masquerade uses the Doom card, you can tell that something's up with the Doom card, right? And also, Dan ends up battling Shinji again in the next episode, right before he fights Masquerade. So if I'm watching this back to back, right, Dan fights the same dude 3 times in the span of the first 2 episodes. The only thing that really puts episode 2 battle over it is Drago's here, so it's nowhere near as boring. This could just be me yapping, but it's just how I feel. When it comes to opponents, Shunji and Ben aren't really that exciting. So maybe if we had someone who was a bit more entertaining for these battles, then maybe it would be a bit more memorable to me. Again, if we had tweaked the story a bit, or heck, even if you just cut this and the opening monologue before the theme song happens just filled us in on everything, and the actual first episode was episode 2 with Masquerade, I think, again, this would be much higher for me. Okay, now we're getting to the ones I actually kind of like. Next, we have Mechtanium Surge Part 2, and that is, well, the opening tournament and the Quartergon battle with all the Mechtagon. If I go over the things I'm not too crazy on, Guz as a character is something I've talked about already, but it's at least alluded to that he's somewhat on the same par as Dan, and his backstory is basically Dan beat him so badly that he just put in the extra effort so he would never lose like that ever again. Yes, Spectra, but we don't really see the backstory, and that's a wild accusation to comparison to make, but it's kind of what happened. And I do think that if they had the power of hindsight, they really should have used Guz to fight Dan instead of Ben in part 1 of Mechtanium Surge, so that way things would kind of come full circle and at least the 2 parts would feel a bit more connected. And while I am about to praise this, I think too many things are happening a little too quickly, because the new status quo for this final installment into the OG Bakugan world is that after everything that happened with Magmail, things are somewhat picking back up again. They're still on Earth, but now Mira is back, and Mira is basically taking up the spot of being the smart one. We have Marucho, who is, the smart one, but now it's Mira, and she's making all these high-tech battle suits, and she's making all of their gear. That is, like, the last major thing I'm not too crazy on. I'm not going to go too much into it here, because it's not really that relevant to the overall point. And finally, the other thing I'm not a big fan of is the fact that the G-Power is gone. This is an issue that Gundalian Invaders started in the middle of its season, and it just never came back. But it is what it is. Now, on to what's actually happening. I basically gave you guys the rundown of GUDS, but the tournament, or basically the best of the best, is going on. And there are 2 matches that we get to see, kinda, at least the ending of them. It's GUDS versus Marucho, somewhat show that he's a threat, I guess. And it doesn't do the best job of conveying that because, well, these battles are happening pretty quickly. And also, it's Marucho. Like, I love the kid, but, like, he's not the best on the totem pole as much as the show sometimes try to convinces us that he is. Also, he has a new partner who we're not really attached to either. And out of all of Marucho's partners, this one is kind of the most forgettable one. But the battle did what it needed to do. It shows that Guz is somewhat of a main character, or he's going to be somewhat of a important character to the story. The other one, which is the one that I think is one of the reasons why I think if this episode slowed down, this easily could have been number 1 to me, and it's Dan versus Shun. This is their final battle, and while it is very quick, it tells a lot about these 2 characters and where they are at this point, especially after they had the falling out that they did in Mechtanium Surge Part 1. Shun does have a new partner, but he looks so similar to the last guy that I honestly thought they were the same person growing up, but the overall gist is Shun and Dan are fighting, and Dan has evolved Drago again. This was done in the finale to Part 1, but it looks like Shun actually could end up winning this battle, and part of the reason is, well, 1, Shun's just that guy, and 2, he knows Dan really, really well, and it seems like he could actually win because of this. And Dan's only way of winning is, at least in the dub, they specify that Dan has to use one of Shun's quote ninja tricks to get the jump on him. And because Shun didn't see that coming, it's what gave Dan the win. And there's this little cute moment between the 2 that just shows off how good friends they are. And after everything that they went through in the previous part, it was really, really nice to see. Then the final battle is going to be the rematch between Dan and Guz, but the battle is interrupted by these new evil Mechtagaun that show up. The Mechtagaun have kind of overstayed their welcome to me at this point, but Cordogon and his crew were actually just really entertaining. The fact that they're these sentient evil Mechtagaun that killed their creator and they're just going off and doing their own thing was a really interesting concept and a perfect idea for a final boss of the series as a whole. Because the Mechtagaun is essentially the ultimate symbol of the bond between a human and their Bakugan partner. And the fact that they don't have that Bakugan or human partner in general, it's a good idea. I understand the vision. And the other thing I like is the characterization of these villains, because this is their first time in the human world and they're processing all of this information on the fly. For example, okay, they attacked Riptak and they see, okay, so when Bakugan are defeated, they return to this ball form. We gotta take note of that. Hey, what happens if we pummel the humans? What do they turn into? Let's find out. And that immediately got me hooked. I was like, okay, this is pretty good. They're kind of cooking. And I also like that they like Transformers combined. I guess Power Rangers Megazords, but I use Transformers analogies a lot. I'm sorry, guys. But yeah, they combine into, I think Mactavius Destroyer is the name. And when I was rewatching this, you know, I had that thing in the back of my head, okay, I like these guys. I like these guys as villains. They're really good. And the overall battle it's all right. I've been very vocal that I wish Zethon was still here. He's still the coolest Mechtagaun to me. But Dragonoid Destroyer does its job. And I think just the fact that it had the making to be a great episode, but maybe because this season is a lot shorter than the others, it's pretty much half. They just had to slow things down because I easily could have seen them splitting this one episode into 2 parts. And I probably still would have counted it as one episode for this video, but just the ideas they had for this debut was really, really interesting to me. If other people didn't like it, I kind of understand, but I just think this was a really good step in the right direction after part 1 of Mechtanium Surge. Now, is the entirety of Mechtanium Surge part 2 good? Well, that's to really be debated. But yeah, let's get on to the peak stuff. The best one is kind of obvious, but I'm still going to leave some suspense. Before we get there, though, the second best for me is Gundalian Invaders' first episode. So off rip, what's so great about this is it feels like a weird, fresh start in a way. Dan's in a completely new town because he moved away from home. Conveniently, Julie also had moved. And I like that the episode starts off almost exactly like the first episode of Battle Brawlers. You know, Dan is getting his stuff ready, rushing to try to hurry up and try to go out and play Bakugan in his own. And his mom's doing yoga, telling him to, you know, do all this stuff before he heads out. It was neat. And while some seasons have to try to find a way to nerf Drago while also building up a new enemy, or it's just not really explained how these guys are able to keep up with Drago. This one is just unapologetically, Dan is the strongest. Like, he's the best. So the big battle this episode was supposed to be Dan and this new character, Jake. But an, quote, accident happens, so he has to fight Ren, Murch's new best friend, who helped him build Bakugan Inner Space, or at least help finish Bakugan Inner Space. And while we didn't, or at least weren't supposed to know Ren was a Gundalian at the time, this being Ren's debut as a battler was absolutely perfect. And it's also a little sad this is probably one of him and Lionholt's best showings, because we know his loss-win record is terrible. But to explain how is he able to keep up with Drago, well, there's two things. One, the big elephant in the room of Lionholt is a special type of Bakugan. He has something called the Forbidden Power. I did a video on this, but it's not entirely explained. But we know this thing is so powerful that later in the season, Dragonoid Colossus has to show up to stop Lionholt because he's just too darn strong. And also, well, you know, he's a Gundalian, and these guys are no pushovers. And the fact that as soon as the battle starts, we're like, okay, well, Ren has to go up against Dan. How well is he going to do? And it's not like it's completely even. Dan is definitely having Ren on the back foot most of the time, but it's really, really interesting how a lot of the focus is on Ren and Lionholt, because we've never seen a Bakugan like him, and this is the first time Marucho's seen Ren battle as well. So we're in shock as the audience. And this guy's, you know, the new member of the Battle Brawlers. I also like that this is 3 rounds instead of the usual 2 that we get with these type of battles, New Vestroia and so on, because it shows off that both battlers are capable, and it's not like a one-sided curve stomp. And if I had to change anything about this battle, you know, besides the fact that Runo and Alice aren't here, I'm a little divided on if I would have rathered Ren win this fight or not. What happens in the final clash is they both use their battle gear, use their battle go abilities, and during the clash, an explosion happens, and it forces Dan to see what's happening in Gandalia or Nethia, because, you know, Bakugan are at war, and they cancel the battle, so there is no winner, or at least it's a draw. And that's fine. Like, for Ren's first battle to us, the audience at the time when this came out, he draws against Dan. That's cool. That's really awesome, especially because unlike in New Vestroia, where they kind of had to nerf Drago so there could be a story, Drago is at full power. Like, he's just as powerful as he was last time we saw him. So Ren being able to tie with him in one of his first battles is a really good feat. It's a really good showing. And I think the only reason I'm divided on if I want Ren to win or not is just because I have the rest of the season to look at. And I think that if Dan lost to Ren in the first battle, it would show that there's still room to grow, I guess. And also would later reveal just how dangerous the Gundalians are. We know how dangerous the Gundalians are later on, because like 2 episodes or so from this, he ends up having to fight Sid and I think Lisa, and they're so good it actually makes Dan a little panicky. So overall, this is good, like really, really good. I understand Gundalian Invaders is when a lot of people like checked out of Bakugan, and I get that to some extent, but it's probably my guilty pleasure season. I love this season so much, especially this first episode. It's so amazing. Anyway, let's get on to what we all know is number 1. The best debut out of Bakugan Gen 1 is New Vestroia, and for me, it's not even close. When you really think about it, New Vestroia had a lot going against it, because I remember seeing the poster for it, and then me and my friends immediately watched the episode, because they were, okay, so we missed the debut, right? But Cartoon Network used to have a player on its website, so you could like watch old episodes of some shows, right? And they had the first episode of Bakugan up, or sorry, New Vestroia up, right? And we immediately see that there's a bunch of new people we don't recognize. So it tells us, okay, so we're getting some new people replacing old people, right? We're all familiar with the Yu-Gi-Oh! Pokemon stuff. And yeah, we knew it to kind of expect, but it had a lot going against it. You have to follow up Bakugan, which is an amazing first season. So all the pressure was on them. And they knocked it out of the park. Immediately, we're introduced to the Vexos and the fact that they imprisoned all the Bakugan. We introduce a new battle system and new characters and new villains. Like, the Masquerade was a amazing villain. Like, I still think he's up there for, like, probably arguably the best one. Naga was a great final boss. I'm not too crazy about King Zenoheld, but the Vexos were, like, they were good villains for what they needed to be, and everyone loves Spectra. And the fact that we also get to see Spectra take out Tigrera, which hurt my soul personally, because Tigrera is my favorite Bakugan of all time. But it was a creepy showing, because I'm like, okay, what do they do against a guy who can just be immune to anything? And getting to the actual main battle itself. So Drago, after seeing Tigrera loses, basically has to create a new body for himself. He's nowhere near as powerful as he used to be. And this is the attempt of nerfing Drago so the story can happen. So he finds Dan, leaves everyone else behind. Marucho sneaks along with them. We all know how I feel about how the female cast is treated in New Vestroia, but for the first episode, I thought it was fine. They get to New Vestroia, immediately they run into the Vexos, and they start going at it immediately after, Mira shows up and gives Dan a gauntlet. And we are introduced to the new battle system and the new rules. And this is one thing that I put above the original season of Bakugan, is because the rules are different. And because of that, they have to show off how the rules are done. And if things are crazy different, they mostly explain everything to us. For example, the big thing were double abilities and the life gauge. Like that was something that everyone, or Marucho, took notice of immediately. And me and my friends were talking about the fact that, so there's new rules now, and we're us trying to piece together how does that work. We never really figured it out, if I'm being honest, because we were kids and we were just like, oh, well, I'll use this ability to do this, and we just kept doing it till we ran out. Anyway, for the episode itself, right, there's 2 rounds in this one, and Dan just kind of curve stomps it. I'm really hard on Mira and her ability as a battler, but I think Mira was used perfectly for this first battle. She was shown to be competent, but she was basically going at it 2 against 1 against 2 of the Vexos, and they're, the big bads right now. And Dan shows up, throws his new evolved, I think it's Neo Dragonoid, I can't remember the name, but he throws in the new Drago form, and immediately takes out one of the Bakugan without even using ability. Just by entering the battle, he beats somebody. That was the coolest thing to me as the kid. Like, this spinning fire tornado when he comes out is so iconic to me. And yeah, later we get the double abilities, and we see how those work, and the fact that Dan got the hang of them immediately, because it's Dan. And this was such a good way to show off, like, okay, this is how things are going to be. And yeah, like, I don't know what else to say, but this is just a great episode. It's a perfect first battle. Like, it does everything right. And yeah, with that, we have it done. What do you guys think in the comments down below? What's your favorite first episode? What's your favorite debut battle? If you guys completely disagree with me on season 1, I completely understand that. It's just how I feel, but I have a lot of crazy takes. That's all I can say if you're new to the channel. So for the next video, I'm not completely decided yet, but it's not going to be Bakugan related. I just know that I want to test the waters to see what else I can do in terms of content. Well, okay, if it is Bakugan related, it's going to be a little different, but I need a lot of time to properly plan out how I'm going to do this video. I have some options, but once I get a definitive plan on what I want to do, I'll ask you guys in the community tab, you know, out of these options, which would you want to see first? And whenever that video goes up, I'll go back to, you know, just the regular Bakugan content. For those, again, who haven't been paying attention, I want to start doing some other videos besides Bakugan, because I know I'm not going to just stick with Bakugan forever, especially since I'm not entirely motivated to look at the reboot of either of them as of right now. I may one day, but as of right now, not really. And because of that, that does somewhat limit what I'm able to do, because I know top 10 videos just don't do that well on this channel. So I want to go a bit more out there. For example, I do want to tackle some stuff with Naruto, some stuff with Emeralds and Shadow, and I kind of want to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5, but that's going to be an interesting segue all around. But yeah, without further ado, I'm Mike the Warrior, and I'll catch you guys next time.